All right, thanks for joining us today and welcome everyone to this important discussion of the rules around normalized metered energy consumption in California. You can skip to the next slide. I wanted to start with just a basic overview of what's in there and encourage everyone to dig in on their own. The rulebook starts with a nice overview of the origins and the scope and applicability. And then it quickly dives into the program level requirements, which include a detailed list of the things program administrators must include in their M&V plans, which is embedded in the implementation plans. The payments and incentives section is also defined there, and it ensures that there's a connection between NMEC and performance by including a requirement that 50% of the payment is tied to performance. There's also design criteria, permissible project types, and qualifying measures in that section. If you move into the general requirements section, that's where you can find kind of the core information about the commission review procedures, which maintain an expedited review path for M&V plans that use open source calculation approaches and software, and a commission pre-review and qualification path for M&V plans that use proprietary approaches. In the update to the rulebook, the Commission also stated that it's going to allow savings claims to be made prior to the end of the performance period, but include a true-up process. Finally, and you can find 4 pages of relevant definitions and a matrix of the approval requirements and pathways at the end of the document to help you navigate the submission and update process for NMEC programs. Next slide. So this rulebook has been a long time coming, starting with the legislation in 2015. And since then, there have been rulings and guidebooks and workshops and working groups, which have really informed its development and brought us to now. And as such, it's the product of significant stakeholder input. It also reflects the important lessons learned through pilots, in which regulators, program administrators, and implementers have all taken a big leap to try new approaches for capturing the value of energy efficiency. And the release of this rulebook really signals a new phase in scaling meter-based efficiency. It applies to one of the largest investments in demand-side resources in the state of California, the energy efficiency portfolio, which is funded through the public purpose surcharge and also electric procurement rates. Historically, this pot of funds has been at about $1 billion a year, and despite some dips recently, demonstrated impacts at the meter have a real chance at revitalizing the investments in energy efficiency, not just in the energy efficiency portfolio, but as we branch into non-wires alternatives, local procurement, and demonstrating resource adequacy impacts of these types of interventions. Meter-based programs through NMEC can establish a path toward integrated solutions and demand flexibility to target emission reductions and optimize our evergreening grid. So the utilities, CCAs, RENs, and third-party implementers now have the rules of the road and the flexibility to adapt by the Commission. And we believe that your years of experience of interacting with customers puts you in the prime place to capture the stranded potential and demonstrate energy efficiency's value as a true grid resource. Next slide. So as I noted, this rulebook was long awaited, and I know everyone is anxious to get moving given the other challenges of delayed contracting, which is kind of an unintended consequence of the rolling portfolio structure. And while Commission staff did not require that these rules be applied retroactively, they are explicit in saying that when new versions of the rulebook are adopted, PAs and implementers should look to adapt their existing programs to the new rulebook requirements when feasible and appropriate. Next slide. So based on the discussions today, you may want to revisit your M&V plan. You may want to revisit your program implementation plan, and it's in your hands to do so, and the Commission is encouraging that as well. So when you look at these 7 elements that the CPUC is requiring, they all kind of circle around NMEC methods and point towards transparency. It may make your ex-post evaluation life easier by being prepared with these key components that the CPUC is requiring, But I think more importantly, it's going to enhance the ability of aggregators and program administrators to deliver quality programs, improve your cost effectiveness, and demonstrate the savings with meter-based results well before an ex post evaluation would start. So you get the flexibility to deliver, and they get the assurance that it showed up. And together we can scale this with confidence. Next slide. While the Commission laid out rules for both site-specific and population NMEC, we're going to focus the discussion today primarily on the population methods as defined in the rulebook. The key components of those definitions are that you're looking at pre and post-intervention energy usage data observed at the meter rather than an engineering forecast or a deemed value. And the second component is that the measurement methods and calculation software are set before the program starts and apply to all sites in a uniform fashion. So keep those things in mind as we go through some of these solutions as we do the rest of the presentation. So I'm going to hand it off to McGee, and he's going to walk through some of these key components of the rulebook and then hone in on some of the opportunities that we think it presents for you to optimize your programs. And then we're going to open it up for some questions and more discussion via the chat. McGee?
Thanks, Carmen. And for those of you who joined late, that was Carmen. I'm McGee. We're with Recurve. Thanks for joining us today and listening in on our perspectives on the new rulebook. Obviously, this is a big step forward for the industry, and we're excited to share the conversation with you. We do have a chat over in the options as you're looking. So I think feel free to type in your questions as I go through the rest of the presentation, and we'll save some time at the end for responding to those. This is being recorded for posterity. We'll make it available to all the participants. So if there's anything in here that you wanted to come back to and reference, that'll be available for you. And we'll also make the slides available to everybody as well. So let me start actually not with the rule book, actually, but with kind of the elephant in the room, I guess, which is this question of given NMEC and all of this, like what else is changing and not changing? And one of the things that's not changing are the rules around cost effectiveness. So as you all know, this is something that we've been kind of pushing on in a parallel way to try to reform some of the ways in which we're thinking about cost effectiveness. It looks like we have some time yet to go before we see the fruits of that labor. So, but which is I think for NMEC though presents some opportunities to work within the existing cost effectiveness framework to make your programs more cost effective through NMEC. And so I wanted to show just kind of a couple of different illustrations of how we're thinking about that, and hopefully this will kind of get the juices flowing for you and thinking about how you can use NMEC to show how your programs, to make your programs more cost effective, but also to show how they could be more cost effective through an NMEC savings claim approach. So what you're looking at is a representation of what a typical program outcome would look like, where the particular projects within a program are going to, some of them are going to perform really well from a savings perspective, and some of them are going to perform, some people's bills are going to go up and some people's bills are going to go down. And from a cost effectiveness standpoint, what you're being measured on now is not, how many of a particular, widget can you go out and get people to install in their home, but really, what is the performance of those widgets that you get installed, and to the extent that you can ahead of time figure out who's more likely to fall into the right-hand side of the distribution here versus who's going to fall into the left-hand side of the distribution, you can make your programs more cost-effective from an NMEC standpoint. So the good news is that this is largely a knowable answer that you can actually, now the outliers you're never really gonna know. So the people on the far left, had quadruplets and their grandparents came to live with them, and they added a hot tub and a swimming pool. And the people on the far right, who saved a ton became hermits and adopted a zero net impact to the planet kind of attitude. It's going to be hard to pick those out ahead of time, but the people in the middle, you can really start to understand, you can know based on characteristics of their home prior to even doing a project. And so we've been looking at this, doing some backcasts of various sorts with existing programs. And this, I won't get into some of the details, but what I've highlighted on the right-hand side is that by selecting, if we were to select ahead of time projects that had homes or buildings that had energy use patterns that were that we could anticipate would do well under a certain type of program. What we've shown here is that just by selecting those buildings that, by targeting those buildings that have a higher propensity to save, we're in effect doubling cost effectiveness or doubling the avoided costs associated with a particular program by focusing on those buildings with the highest propensity to save. So what this is going to require, though, is that in particular for third-party programs, but this is still in the hands mostly of utilities, is working together between program administrators and program implementers to use data that's available on the potentially targeted population, the general population of participants, to identify using some of these metrics, for example, the customers that have the highest afternoon ramps, or whose homes or businesses are the most sensitive to changes in outdoor temperature, or who might be the best candidates for heat pumps, or conversely, might be the worst candidates for retrofits. And so to avoid, trying to get customers into expensive retrofit packages if their homes are unlikely to see a material change in their energy use consumption as a result. And you can see over on the right that one of the implications of this is that the red dots represent sort of an average customer profile. The blue line represents the customer, this is a load shape profile of customers who might have, for example, high annual consumption and high peak summer kilowatt hour usage. That versus, the gray line, which is if you were to select on those particular characteristics, the gray line would represent the load shape pattern of customers that you chose not to target for your program. And this can have a really big implication on the overall cost effectiveness as well as the customer satisfaction associated with an NMEC program. So I kind of want to put that out there just as a starting point for the conversation, and thinking an NMEC savings claim is not just about the formal act of filing a savings claim with the commission, but in fact it's more of, encompasses the broad life cycle of program design, implementation, and measurement. So let me turn it back over to Carmen briefly for kind of an intro to what the commission is asking for in terms of making a savings claim.
Yeah, I think before I dive into that too, I think it's important that when you look at the rule book, there is a distinction that's emerged about payable savings and claimable savings, and that's kind of been an evolution in definitions that came out of the pilots. The claimable savings, however, need to be very tightly tied to the payable savings, especially since there's going to be a 50% performance requirement. Having a disconnect between those two, I'm sure you can imagine the different challenges that could come out of having, two sets of books that are not necessarily related to each other. And that's really where the methods and software, standardized methods and software really come into play as well. They offer this consistency and transparency that was highlighted in the rulebook that really enables population NMEC to even exist. It enables you to do the calculations across the entire population, for example, as opposed to a sample-based calculations. It is available to everyone, so program implementers can have access to those results and have a clear and clean understanding of how they're affecting their customers, but also a reasonable expectation of how they're going to be judged by their program administrator and the evaluators or the commission. And it provides a lot more transparency in the process. You know, as a former evaluator and at the California Public Utilities Commission, one of the big challenges that we had was bridging that gap from looking at the savings calculations that were coming in on a deemed basis, truing them up with kind of very hyper-specific parameter updates. And in doing that, we would sometimes lose how that was actually affecting the grid and how those meter-based impacts were playing out. So Caltrac and the OpenEE meter are a solution to that by providing a meter-based standardization that steps beyond in an evaluation protocol. It gives you much more detail than IPMVP, the International Measurement and Verification protocols, because it gives you this executable, enough detail that you can repeat the calculations over and over and over, and have consistency across different parties that are doing that. So the Caltrac methods, I would assume most people kind of know what those are, but McGee's going to step into more of the detailed calculation methods. But I just wanted to reaffirm that the rulebook really points to encouraging stakeholders to participate in these process, and we encourage you to do that too. So if you'd like to join these working groups, let us know as well. McGee, I'll send it back to you for the diving into some of the calculations there.
Sure. And just to sort of make one point here, obviously Recurve played a big role in developing Caltrac, and we built the OpenEE meter. Both of those now are being governed by the Linux Foundation. So there's a formal governance structure that exists that is being driven by stakeholders now, and that process has evolved over the last year, but it kind of points to the value of having, you know, not just one organization be responsible for driving the methods. And I think the Commission really spoke to that as being a value of population NMEC is that it can represent the best practices of the community, while also providing some other pathways for making savings claims where appropriate. So kind of getting into some of these details a little bit. So we've been kind of unpacking, you know, some of the requirements, and we actually filed the first savings claim for a population NMEC program a couple of weeks ago, or we helped file it. So there's some lived experiences here that are kind of informing this conversation a little bit. But one of the distinctions that the rulebook makes is between gross, net, and peak savings. So just to kind of level set with everybody what we're talking about here, because these terms can be, you know, and are really overpacked. There's adjusted gross, there's net to gross. Peak demand has its own kind of peculiarness to it. So in general, what we're thinking about when we think about gross savings is the difference between what you would have been projected to have consumed in terms of energy based on the preconditions of your building. So this is what AB 802 refers to as an existing conditions baseline. So you project forward what you would have used, and you subtract from that what you actually consumed. And so this is when we talk about Caltrac methods, we're generally talking about the approach that's demonstrated on the left here, where you're taking the actual consumption relative to the projections that would have been made for the weather conditions that actually existed in the post-treatment period. Now that's a little bit different than what we're doing when we're making a savings claim for the Commission, because they're asking for the weather conditions to be normalized to a typical weather year. So we're not actually looking for what the energy consumption would have been in the post-treatment period. We're asking what the energy consumption would have been if the weather conditions were typical of a typical weather year. Now, who even knows what a typical weather year is anymore? But nonetheless, there is a formal hourly matrix of temperatures that is published by the state of California that are known as the CZ 2010 and have been recently updated. So it's got a new name now. But those hourly temperature values are what's used to annualize savings to a typical weather year. But they also require a full 12 months of reporting so that you can normalize your reporting period savings to that typical, or reporting period consumption to that typical weather year, from which you can then subtract what you would have used in a typical weather year if your baseline conditions had held versus what you would have used in a typical weather year if your reporting conditions had held. And that becomes the basis for your savings claim. Now, from that, you need to adjust for net savings, which will be I'll get to in a minute. But the third piece to this is this peak demand savings, which tied us in knots a couple of weeks ago as we were trying to figure out what it even means, because it was built around DEER values and deemed savings, so it doesn't actually make any sense when you're talking about metered savings. But this will be something that we have to deal with, I think, in the coming year. But what they're asking there is for your savings to be calculated for particular hours of the day on particular days of the year for the climate zones within which those different projects that you've done exist. All right, so if you're doing a project in climate zone 4, for example, which I think is somewhere in the San Jose area, then on between September 3rd and September 5th, between 2 and 5 p.m., you need to know what the usage would have been in that building if the temperatures during those days were not the actual temperatures of those days, but were those temperatures of those days in a typical weather year as defined by the climate zone normal temperatures. It's insane. And so how do you even know that, right? Which has been, some of the challenge here of interpreting NMEC in the context of these new rules. So this is, just kind of giving you a sense of some of the complexity associated with that. If you're looking at a commercial office building and you want to know what this Wednesday through Friday was that defined that peak period, you can't just take an average, because weekdays and weekends are different. You can't just take the actual consumption, because you need to normalize it to what would have been the case if the weather conditions were that of a typical weather year during those 3 days. So this is part of the openness and transparency of the methods and the approach, is that we've come up with a way to solve for this, and you can, but it's not secret, right? It's not a secret sauce, and it may not even be the best way. It's just like the first way that we're trying to figure out how to come up with suitable metrics. I've linked to it here so that everybody can go look and see how we've done it. And again, this is part of the Caltrack process, is designed to interrogate and investigate these methods so to make sure that they're faithfully representing what we're trying to represent in making these savings claims. I won't touch too much on net savings, but again, once you get to the typical weather year, you have to go one step further, and you apply a lifetime value based on the measures that you've installed, and a haircut for your net to gross adjustment. Now, for most existing measures, there's a net to gross default, but the Commission did leave some space to submit your own net to gross claim, perhaps by running a comparison group to create your own net to gross adjustment. I think for multifamily that has something like a 0.55 default, this seems a little bit more compelling. For residential, the net to gross is already fairly high, so your value add might be somewhat minimal in terms of the cost of creating a comparison group. But nonetheless, that optionality is existing in the rule book. Okay, so that's the complexity of sort of trying to come up with a number that represents the savings that you're claiming for your program. There's also a fairly extensive section within the rulebook that's describing, kind of what I would, characterize as like program management rules. And it's worth kind of taking a little bit of a look through what they've described and how you might go about, thinking about fulfilling some of these. I'm going to be taking a bunch of screenshots from what we've been doing in our platform. Obviously, there's a lot of ways of going about this, and it's meant to be illustrative more than anything else. But it's kind of just to, rather than just having words on the page, to try to give some visuals to go along with it. So one of the big sources of anxiety in making an NMEC, running an NMEC program is what you do with customers that have, what in the industry we call non-routine events. Some outlier event that happens in a building that changes the consumption in a way that distorts the effect of the intervention that you've made. So in my little illustration over here on the right, we have a building that has, a little mom and pop grocery store or something in there, some low level usage, a little bit of a spike at the beginning of the baseline, and then they do the project, and then a month later they put in a data center, and now all of a sudden the usage skyrockets. And if you're the implementer of this program, this project, now you're going bankrupt because this project is swamping the effects of all the other projects that you've done, and your savings claim is completely wiped out. Well, there has to be a way of addressing that, right? And so what the commission said was that, first of all, you have to just spell out in your M&V plan what you're going to do to detect non-routine events. You can it can be qualitative, or it can be quantitative, such as, we use this CBRMSC value to as a flag for a non-routine event. But you can just say, hey, if we have an occupancy turnover, we want to reserve the right to call it a non-routine event if it materially changes the consumption one way or the other. There's flexibility in there. You just have to lay it out ahead of time so that you're not making subjective ad hoc decisions about what constitutes an NRE and what doesn't. What the commission was really worried about was putting a finger on the scale, where the only NREs that exist are the ones that make your savings look bad, and the ones that make your savings look good, get ignored and included in your savings claim. So they want balance on that front. You need a way to record the non-routine events that you do identify, and then a way to report those to the commission as part of your savings claim, and an audit trail so that you can prove your case. The second sort of big programmatic guidance is around eligibility rules and processes. There's the distinction that Carmen made at the beginning between site-based and population, which is obviously a pretty important one. There's some rules around, the kinds of measures that you can that qualify for these programs. Is pretty much what you would expect. But what we're really sort of noticing is that it's not so much eligibility, but ineligibility that kind of represents, what we call the hidden gotcha here. So the question really is not what makes a site eligible, but what makes a site ineligible. And that ineligibility can happen at any point during the program cycle. So they could be ineligible to begin with, and so you don't want to treat them until they become eligible. Or that ineligibility could happen, sometime after you've gone in and done a project in that building. And so what are we thinking about here? We're thinking about incidences where a building or a customer is served by another program. So that might be typically ineligibility prior to a program beginning. The energy use in a building might be wildly inconsistent, and so you'd have a hard time making an NMEC related savings claim for that building, because you just can't tell the difference between, even if that building is part of a population you're making a population claim. If the usage is so wildly up and down, you're just going to get noise out of it, and so it's not going to help you make your savings claim. If there's occupancy, obviously solar panel installation creates some measurement issues when you're looking at whole building energy consumption, or if there are too many non-routine events in a building, that the usage spikes all of a sudden, intermittently and without explanation. These are all potential disqualifying characteristics of a building. So the question that we need to be asking is, what happens if a site becomes ineligible halfway through the program? If you've made that investment into the project, but all of a sudden now you can't get paid anymore because you can't meter your savings, what do you do? And there are ways of solving for these, but that have been developed, and probably more that will come, as more of these programs get off the ground. But it's something that everybody needs to be thinking about. Carmen, do you want to talk a little bit about the payment rules that were part of this guidance?
Yeah, I think the payment rules, which is not the most exciting part probably of the rule book, but it is a really important part. Again, speaks to kind of that linkage across the market transactions. The payments that are made by the PAs have to be determined based on those population approaches for the population solutions anyway. So you can see kind of the connection of how the payments are tied back to the savings that are achieved. Now, that link breaks in terms of what incentives program administrators can be paying to customers, which enables kind of a more flexible way for them to be capturing potential and finding ways to engage customers. But at the end of the day, that 50% of the PA program payments need to be based on the payable savings. So it's pretty, wide boundaries there for program administrators to decide how they want to do this. But I think learning from the pilots, one of the things that's been pretty evident is that you really do need to have a transparent way of calculating what those payments are going to be down to the site level. The customer that you're interacting with obviously needs to have some record of how and why they got paid. The program administrators need to have a consistent record of how and why that payment was made. The program administrator needs to know how the aggregator was making that payment. And then of course the regulators need to know how the program administrators were making that payment. So again, if you have a sequence of this record, at the end of the day, you're going to have kind of an audit trail that syncs up nicely with how the interventions had happened. And it's not unlike deemed savings claims, wherein you know what technology was installed, you know what the incentive was paid, and then that all gets rolled up to be part of your reporting requirements, et cetera. Same principles apply here. It's just that given that there's more flexibility, you're going to have to make sure that you have that documentation. So when you come back around to evaluation activities or audits, you don't have to scramble for that information, but it'll be kind of readily available to you. And that's been kind of one of the lessons learned, I think, from the pilots, that having a system that can do that is pretty important to the transparency of the process and really making the transactions flow.
Great, thanks, Carmen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so getting close to wrapping up here, but there's one sort of big one that wanted to call attention to that can be a little bit intimidating at first to try to wrap your head around. And this is, there's a section in there that's basically stipulating that when filing your NMEC program proposal, so at the early stage of an NMEC program, the commission wants to know, essentially, the question that's getting asked here is, how many projects or how many meters are necessary in order for your portfolio, in order for us to be confident in the savings that you're reporting to us. So there's going to be, one of the kind of core assumptions about population-based NMEC is that there's going to be a fair amount of noise, of changes in energy consumption that are unrelated to the measures being installed within any given building, but across a larger and larger set of buildings, then the signal relative to the noise will begin to emerge. And so at some point you're going to have a tipping point where you feel like there's enough signal relative to the noise where the savings that are being reported, we can be confident that those are coming as a result of the program, as opposed to the kind of randomness that happens, as a part of day-to-day life. And so this can actually be tested ahead of time based on some of the other characteristics of your program that you'd want to be filing at the same time anyway. So for example, when you design and develop a program, you're going to predict the amount of savings that you're likely to see from your program. You're going to say, well, this program is likely to save around 5% or 10% or 15% across my buildings. You're going to have a sector that you're targeting. So this might be, low income residential, or it could be, small and medium business restaurants, or it might, there's office buildings, and so depending on the nature of the class of buildings that you're targeting and the depth of your savings, you can know how many projects need to be in your portfolio by analyzing the sort of typical baseline energy usage of non-treated buildings in your targeted area. So if I was going to target, say, restaurants in San Francisco, what I would do is I would get the data, the 12 months of consumption data from all restaurants in San Francisco, and I would estimate the variability in energy consumption amongst restaurants in San Francisco by building a baseline model of energy use of those buildings, which is going to tell me how erratic the energy use is. And so the more erratic or stable the energy use is, the more confident you are going to be in the savings number that emerges from a project being done at that building. So if I have a fairly stable class of targeted buildings and I have more savings that I'm expecting, if I'm expecting to get, say, 10 or 15% savings versus, say, 2 to 5% savings, then I can reach a desired confidence interval in terms of fractional savings uncertainty with a smaller portfolio. So I don't need as many buildings in my portfolio if those buildings have energy use that's highly stable and if my depth of savings is greater. So this can be a little bit of a daunting task to start with. It requires cooperation from the utility because you need non-participant anonymized data for the particular sector that you're targeting. But it kind of goes hand in hand with the cost effectiveness discussion that we had at the beginning. At the same time that you're trying to make your programs more cost effective by targeting high value customers who will be more likely to succeed within your program model, you can also be analyzing the fractional savings uncertainty requirements that you're going to meet for your program and estimate the number of projects that you'll need to be able to deliver savings with confidence required by the CPUC. So this will be something that everybody's going to have to kind of work through and figure out. And if you want to just throw your hands up and say, we don't know, the CPUC says, well, tell us in your advice letter why you can't figure this out. And there may be some legitimate reasons for that. But again, it's the kind of thing that we've been working on for a while. It's a little daunting at first, but then once you get the hang of it and once you get the data that you need, it becomes a pretty straightforward and in our experience, a fairly useful exercise for both the implementer, the PA, as well as obviously at the end of the day, the regulators who need to have confidence in the savings. So I'll just sort of reiterate that obviously this is something that we've been working on quite a bit. We're really excited about being able, the success of NMEC for us is, kind of, everybody knows, pretty important. But you are the ones that are going to be making it successful, and so we want to be able to help provide best practices. We've got draft M&V plans. Everything we're doing from a methods and a calculation standpoint is open source and available for anybody to use. And again, to sort of second Carmen's kind of call for participation, we're still early on in our thinking, our collective thinking about how to do NMEC the right way. And so these the organizations that have been set up under this Linux Foundation project Caltrack, which is the working group designed to improve the savings calculation, for payable savings. Grid, which is the working group that's been set up for the types of questions that we were looking at today. What is the best way of calculating weather savings in a typical weather year, especially if you're paying savings out over, say, a 2 or 3 year period? Do you just want to use the first year for making a typical weather year claim? There's a lot of unanswered questions that the grid working group has been set up to try to tackle. And then the last part of this is being able to provide data to third parties to be effective participants in NMEC programs is going to require access to customer level data, but that data is protected by an increasing number of laws and an increasing amount of scrutiny. So we have to figure out how to make that data available and useful to third parties while at the same time protecting the individual privacy rights of the customers. And so that third working group that you see there is fairly nascent in its organization, but the idea is that over the long term, we can provide a set of best practices that allow this information to be shared while at the same time protecting individual customer privacy. So we'd love for the community now who's thinking about this and who may be actively trying to deploy NMEC programs to get involved in these efforts so that we can work together to make them as effective as we can. So that's the end of the formal presentation. We have the chat function that is available for folks to raise questions. We thought it would be, it typically works out really poorly just to unmute everybody because, background noise and everything. So if you could type into the chat function your questions, we'd love to hear what you're thinking or offer some perspectives.
Yeah, I have one over here too, if you don't have one queued up. I got a question about, can you please walk through how we can ensure high confidence and precision prior to implementation? And then a follow-up is that it's not clear whether the implementers will reconcile the payments for performance after population level estimates are complete, which are likely to be well after the measures are installed and the customer has been paid the incentive. And then I'll just stop with those two. Then the other one's a different question.
You want to take a crack at it, Carmen, since you read it?
Sure. I mean, I think that the main way that we're trying to offer the commission confidence and precision prior to implementation is that requirement for the fractional savings uncertainty, because when you can be looking at the full population and be doing some of those pre-analytics, you couple that with the style of your program and what types of interventions and the combinations of measures, et cetera, that you're going to be doing. That's how you can kind of get some more greater confidence in terms of how you think that's going to play out. Now, this is a little bit of a chicken and egg game too, because people are going to be learning as they implement, and those are going to create actuarial feedback loops about what's worked, what hasn't. And I think in the pilot phase, we've seen how folks have been kind of learning as they're going and even having to adapt their programs as they get that feedback. So I don't think that there's no silver bullet or a magical crystal ball, but it comes with practice, and it also comes with some of those pre-analytics, like at the very beginning on cost effectiveness of targeting your interventions to places where they're likely to have an impact. So I think that's kind of the main answer. And then on the second question of whether the implementers will reconcile the payments for performance after population, no, the implementers won't be the ones that are reconciling those payments, definitely not with the customer. The customer payments will be done and finished, and then the settlement happens between the aggregators / implementers and the program administrators. So if there are true-ups that happen after that performance period, that would be a settlement between the program administrators and the aggregators. And it's even an option for the program administrators to make those payments to the aggregators, and they could just be settling up with the regulators. So there's a bit of flexibility in terms of how those reconciliation payments are happening, but I think it's pretty, I don't know if it's explicitly written, but it would definitely be a best practice to not go back to the customers to reconcile payments. There needs to be some clarity and finality there, but between aggregators and the PAs, or the PAs and the regulators, there's a little more flexibility.
All right, I got a couple here queued up.
Okay.
Sandy Fischler asks, can you talk more about how to qualify customers for participation effectively? That's a really great question. I'll say, kind of briefly on that, what I've learned, which is that there's kind of two approaches to this. So number one is where you have a set of measures that you want to figure out which homes are best, would be best suited for the particular measures that I plan on implementing. So think about siting, if you're trying to install, say, residential batteries, you want to find the homes that have the greatest overproduction of solar panels from their solar panels during the middle of the day, and the highest ramp in the evening. And then you go knock on their door and say, hey, we have a battery for you. Then the other way of thinking about it is that you're kind of measure agnostic. And then so a customer comes through the door and says, hey, I want to be more energy efficient. And then you look at the pattern of energy use in their home and you say, well, you don't have a lot of heating and cooling load. It's mostly base load. So let's look at a new fridge and maybe some smart plugs and light bulbs versus another customer that comes to the door that has, say a high season, they live out in the Central Valley and they get their air conditioner bills are really high in the summer. You're a great candidate for some HVAC and some shell work. So it kind of, depends on which approach that you want to take with your program. If you want to have a set of measures that you try to find the right houses for, or a set of customers that you try to find the best measures for. And the next question comes from Jesse Mon about the FSU calculation. Yeah, that was, and wondering, about my chart here. This is for illustration purposes only, so don't be freaked out by it. For sure, it's likely, that you would get much better, smaller portfolio numbers based on your fractional savings uncertainty calculation than what's being shown in the image here. So don't be dismayed if you're thinking about I'm going to be targeting 50 customers for my program. That's a lot of times that's going to be fine, especially if you have deeper retrofits. And then the peak demand savings, why not just take the 3 hottest weekday non-holiday days during the baseline and performance period? The Deere approach sounds really strange. Yes, you're 100%, and I think wrong, but that's the rule. So we've got to talk to the powers that be and get them to realize that what they're doing is dumb and that there's a better way. I think that'll happen. It's just part of the peeling back the layers of the onion. You realize that there's dysfunctionality baked very deeply into our existing processes for doing this sort of thing.
Yeah, and I would emphasize the orientation of historic programs, of course, have been on the energy savings, and the peak impacts have been kind of a sidebar. Oh, that happens too. And that's one of the big transitions that's really happening with demand flexibility. LBNL recently did a study about kind of the accidental peak impacts from energy efficiency programs. And we're actually getting a lot of savings on the peak level, but A, we're not quantifying it very effectively, and B, it's not even intentional. So imagine if we're being intentional about capturing that and balancing these things, we could probably be getting even better effects. And I think it shows the promise of actually having integrated solutions, but you can only do that when you have these load shapes. And I think the reporting requirements, et cetera, will evolve from there when we can demonstrate, when we have these data sets that are part of the plan. The load shapes are part of the requirements for data submissions, I believe, too, in the rule book.
And and hopefully it won't be too long before we can submit actual load shapes instead of the year.
Right.
Predetermined load shapes. Again, we'll get there, I think. There was a sort of a half question, half comment about the methodology seeming to be similar to demand response load impacts. I agree, and I bet in the next year or two we'll start to see some pilots that are looking at the effects of energy efficiency and demand response together within the same building. And I don't think it's going to be too far of a stretch to take some of these core approaches and start to merge them together so you can value stack the benefits of doing both kinds of programs together.
Mm-hmm. There's another question from Jesse Mon. Do NREs balance out with large enough populations?
At some level, like a non-routine event is a construction for the industry in the sense that what we're saying is somebody else is going to bear the consequences of energy consumption that wasn't predicted or wasn't based on the expectations of our particular intervention. So we're just going to let the CAISO or the grid be the ones that bear the cost of non-routine events. So in the sense that they balance out with a large enough population, yeah, because we have the 5-minute CAISO market that figures out, oh my gosh, all of a sudden we've got energy spiking somewhere, or we have adjusted demand forecasts because we've installed more and more data centers in California over the last couple of years, or all of a sudden people are leaving California and migrating out to other states, and so there's these kinds of things happen and are solved for because they happen at such a macro level. We have different institutions that solve for changes in energy associated with non-routine events. And for us, the impact of for the work that we do in energy efficiency, in particular, the impact of non-routine events, it has the potential to swamp the impact of the measures that we're installing, and so it becomes hard for us to quantify the benefit of energy efficiency without addressing the non-routine events that happen. But as to the extent, if we had a program with 100,000 participants, and maybe we had a control group even, then those non-routine events would balance out. And to the extent that they don't balance out, we'd expect them to occur in the same frequency with the control group as with the participating group. So yes, but we can't, while we have still, fairly small scale programs and the potential for those non-routine events to outweigh the benefits that we're measuring, we still have to be able to figure out how to address them. So Jonathan Budner asks, please discuss the current state of play on how to account for known and known NREs, such as installing PV or acquiring EVs. That's it. Jonathan, I'm so surprised to hear you ask that question. So there's two ways of doing that. So number one is that, and I think the easiest way of doing that is by requiring the submetering of solar panels and electric vehicle chargers, and at particular periods of time, backing those out of your savings claim or backing those into your savings claim based on the values that you've been able to submeter. So instead of, for example, trying to fit, I'm not sure if I put a good slide in here for demonstrating this, but if you have all of a sudden, solar panels being installed, obviously your building energy model is going to be, distorted by the impact of solar panels. But we can still actually just calculate the net effect, including the solar panels, and then to the extent that we've tracked the amount of solar panel production, we can back that out of whatever the savings it is that we observe. The other is to come up with some more complicated ways of adding additional variables, like our expected solar panel consumption, and try to change the underlying data that you're using rather than the whole building meter data. I think that's still a little bit farther down the road, and But obviously, as we get into NMEC and we have more DERs being deployed, we're going to have to come up with something. The most obvious answer is to quit treating all this differently and just count it all the same: solar panels, electric vehicles, increases and decreases in energy consumption, and focus on the time of day in which this is happening. Because ultimately, none of it really matters when we're talking about annual savings. What really matters is it happening in the middle of the day when we have an overproduction of energy, or in the peak period in the summertime when we're firing up all of our peaker power plants. So the best way to solve for solar panels and other DERs is to completely get rid of the paradigm in which we're calculating annual savings and focus entirely on hour by hour savings. I think that's ultimately where we have to get to. And Katrina,
sorry, I just want to piggyback on that. In the rulebook, there is an allowance for submetering. So there's some specifications in there about what kind of the quality of that submetering, and I think it was probably anticipated in the context of site-specific savings claims, but that might end up applying to, or you could leverage that in how you were dealing with some of these other things too, before we get to the more ideal world like McGee is describing.
And we're just about at the top of the hour, but I'll sneak in Katrina's question, which is, I think, top of everybody's mind, which is like, can you trust the numbers? She put it more elegantly, how will we be able to achieve accurate savings data with all these anomalies? How do we know if the projections are accurate? Sort of the fundamental challenge with meter-based savings. It's, I describe to my kids what we do as, how much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? And like, literally there's no answer. So like, how do we know if it's accurate or not? There is no alternate universe that tells us this is what would have happened if things had turned out differently. And which is, kind of goes back to the core principles that the CPUC started with when allowing population NMEC savings claim to happen. They said, we're going to accept your outputs, your answers for how much these projects saved, if they're being generated through open source tools and methods that everybody can inspect and understand how you arrived at your answers. This is fundamentally why open source matters, because if you don't know how you got the answer, if the methodology for getting to the counterfactual that you're using to claim your savings is obscured or opaque in some ways, there is no way for us to know if the answer is like accurate or not. And even though we'll never know for sure, if we're using open source methodology, open source tools, we're transparent about how we get from here to there. We can all agree that it faithfully represents the way in which we're trying to get about that. And I think that's a really important principle for us to end the presentation on. So on behalf of Carmen, I'd like to thank you guys for sitting in for the hour. Again, we'll follow up with you guys and have more of a conversation. Obviously, there's a long way to go with this, but we're excited to have you be a part of it with us. Thank you.